My name's Martin Parsons and I'm going to explain why only the Conservative Party has got a genuinely sensible approach to climate change. Now, on the one hand, we've got reform. Reform, it seems, cannot even make up their mind as to whether they actually believe climate change is real or not. We know it's real. We can see its effects all around us. On the other hand, though, we've got the Liberal Democrats, the Labour Party, the Green Party, who are ideologically fixated on something called the government net zero target. Now, I find that most ordinary people don't even understand exactly what that is. So I'm going to explain that and also set out why that's pretty problematic in terms of infringing people's basic freedoms and human rights, something that really doesn't get talked about enough. First of all, though, we're standing here on the east coast of England. It's an area where I live. It's a very beautiful area, but we are absolutely on the forefront, the front line of climate change. Since 1900, sea level around the UK coast has risen by 28 centimetres. That's about a foot in old money. It's currently rising at 3 millimetres a year. That probably doesn't sound much, but if you add it up year by year, what it does mean is that regularly seawalls that were built after the 1953 floods tragedy will be regularly overtopped by the highest tides. It also means that we're already seeing rapidly increasing coastal erosion, threatening people's homes and businesses. And of course, this summer we see more and more wildfires. There's a number just over that way in the last couple of weeks destroyed quite large areas of farmland. So climate change is real. But what about net zero? What is it? Well, the idea of net zero was introduced by the last Labour government in the 2008 Climate Change Act. And what that did was to place a legal duty on every future government to reduce carbon emissions by the year 2050 down to, and I quote, by at least 100% of 1990 levels. What does that mean? Well, that is net zero. But even if we just took the 1990 levels, it is almost impossible for any UK government to reduce carbon emissions down to that level without infringing on people's basic freedoms and human rights. And there are two reasons for that. The first reason is that since 1990, the UK's experienced a 12 million growth in its population, largely due to immigration. So in order to get our carbon emissions down to 1990 levels, the government would need to introduce some form of population control. That doesn't just mean net zero migration, but also some form of government-sponsored birth control, perhaps a bit like China's one-child policy. That's a massive violation of people's basic freedoms and human rights. The second problem with that target is when we look at the areas that produce the most carbon emissions, most of those are not at all under the direct control of the government. So, for example, 31% of carbon emissions come from transport. That's things like people's private cars. Now, if we were to try to reduce car ownership down to 1990 levels, when there was an average of one car per household, we've got a problem because population's increased by 12 million. So any government rationing of cars to get it down to that level of car ownership would be significantly less than one car per household. That would be a huge restrictions on people's basic freedoms to get about, to get to work, particularly badly affect people in rural areas. One of the other major areas of carbon emissions is farming. Agriculture contributes 13% of our annual carbon emissions, and that's things like cows, excuse the expression, farting. Now, of course, the government could nationalise all farms, it could take control of them, it could ban meat production. It could effectively make us all go vegan. But again, that would be a massive violation of people's individual freedom and basic human rights. So this net zero target, this legally binding duty that's been placed on every government to reduce carbon emissions down to net zero, is not only unachievable in practical terms, it actually could only be done by violating people's basic freedoms and human rights. Now, we're already seeing some of the practical problems of that. This summer, we saw some hospitals were actually cancelling blood tests for cancer patients because they need to keep those blood tests at a particular temperature, but they were not allowed to use air conditioning because of the government net zero target. That meant people were waiting for cancer tests. People's lives were literally being put at risk by this arbitrary net zero target. Most people would say that is completely wrong, and of course you'd be right to say that. That's why we need to scrap this net zero target. We still need to do everything we can to reduce our carbon emissions, but this arbitrary target is creating so many problems, it cannot be achieved. We need to find another way, incentivising people, encouraging people to reduce their carbon emissions. And we need to tackle not just climate change in the future, which the Liberal Democrats, the Green Party and the Labour Party seem fixated on, but also what's happening already here and now. Rising sea levels, rapidly increasing coastal erosion, and how do we actually reduce the vulnerability of open countryside to wildfires. That's a sensible climate change policy. Reform just don't get it, they're not even sure if climate change is real. The Liberal Democrats, Labour and the Green Party, they're ideologically fixated on net zero. Only the Conservative Party has got a genuinely sensible climate change policy. Thank you for listening. I'm Martin Hart.